Okay, so I guess this is going to be a sort of strange recording, a kind of political analysis, one that I almost don't even want to publish. I just want to sort of share in private, perhaps, as a kind of as an important uh, planning kind of strategic overview but a necessary or a kind of project that has to contend on many different fronts, but that really needs to develop a lot of sort of cohesion and pulling together and a kind of central focus if it's going to overcome the kinds of obstacles that exist. Now, uh, I've thankfully I don't have to do all my own thinking for myself, but I do think that I have a gift of somewhat collating a lot of complicated things together, and sort of imbibing a lot of the projections and the interpretation of the IRR and Franz Cunier and all the other analysts there, um, and I think that their general reading of the situation looks quite rosy as it is, but sort of the devil is in the detail and the minutiae. I think anyway. So this recording is made to sort of from a DA perspective and is made to sort of um, look at the DA inside out. And I think that generally speaking, the DA understands the predicament that it's in, but when I look at it from the outside, I don't know if it properly understands all the conditions that are required for it to generally succeed in its, like, I know that the DA itself does not have to win an election. It has to be part of a coalition that is capable of commanding a majority, essentially, to win a national election. That's the prize that we're going for. So it doesn't have to independently win a majority, uh, but it also would be nice if it grew. Obviously, in some expedient sense, it shouldn't try to grow at the expense of the other political opposition parties that it's capable of forming um, some kind of broad coalition with. So, those are some of the sufficient conditions. Now, the politics of the DA is essentially going to, as somewhat projecting that it's going to be the largest constituent of a broad coalition and it's going to be a necessary anchor to be a successful coalition. It has to overcome a certain kind of ideological obstacle, one that it is capable of defending against, but that it is perhaps unproven in prosecuting its case against and indicting um, other forms of thinking. And I think that there is a huge scope for, in some sense, educating the electorate in South Africa. And I can put this in a lot of different ways. I wish I could introduce and present this general necessity more persuasively, but let me just say that not enough to say that the DA gets things done. The DA has to make the proper diagnosis as to why, and it has to be able to make that case to the electorate as to why has South Africa ostensibly failed? Why is the ANC government and form of politics, why is it devastating? Why hasn't it worked? What hasn't worked and why hasn't it worked? We have to make that case. We have to make that kind of indictment against our ideological adversaries, because just defending against the ideological adversaries is like, we're not making a moral argument, a counter moral argument. We are simply defending against the moral arguments being raised, and the DA gets constantly pilloried, as it were. And it seems as if we don't quite understand, or the DA doesn't quite know what is required in order to overcome this kind of ideological opposition. And it's very sensitive to sort of not taking the bait, because essentially what it's up against is a rather fascistic ideological machine of dishonesty that, pretty much follows the Goebbels playbook of propaganda, which is that, accuse your adversaries doing of what it is that you are doing, because it sows confusion. It makes it impossible, because as soon as they say, no, 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 everything that you're accusing us of, you are guilty of, if you start making that case, then essentially uh, they've got the tide of, or if it seems that you are denying something, and then you're sort of passing the accusation back onto them, that seems like quite a kind of a confused thing to have to articulate. And that because in some sense, to actually make that counter argument, you have to kind of reframe everything from the current narrative that is being broadcast by all of news media, by all of these ideologues that, sort of create a kind of toxic consensus and sit as this sort of millstone within, sort of holding back the winds of change in South African politics. And also, I would add, sort of entrenching a kind of democratic illiteracy. Now, the only way to overcome such a kind of ideological adversary is somewhat two things. Is that you have to call them dishonest, and you have to consistently explain what it is that they are doing that is dishonest. And out of repetition and consistency, and essentially you need time to be convincing on this front, because it needs time to sink into the electorate. You have to keep on repeating the same claim over and over again until the people that hear this repetitive complaint of yours, that you keep on lamenting the same thing, that then they say, oh yes, they are actually talking about reality, and the people who they are saying are guilty of the thing that they're accusing the DA of, that the DA is correct in this case, and the people who are essentially lobbing accusations against them, there's something fishy there. There's something rotten in the state of Denmark, and you really have to. That requires a kind of ideological consistency and a cohesion, but also an understanding of the importance of making that kind of polemic, of making that kind of move, which is not just a kind of defensive move, but is a kind of indictment, a moral indictment, a moral ideological position and in some sense, the DA is still prone to what I would call a kind of ideological bucket fishing, because if it only defends its own reputation every time that it is attacked, it doesn't ever bank ground. It doesn't ever gain ground in the kind of ideological opposition, because it expects each atomized electoral person who's on the fence to connect these dots in their head. And the DA is not, in some sense, making a broad enough, consistent enough, repetitive enough complaint against the people who are leveraging these kinds of ideological, racial scapegoating and attacks. And the DA, although has at many occasions mentioned these things, it can't really break through the veneer of, I guess you could call it the sort of the corrupt media establishment. It can't really assail the ideological narrative which it's sort of been contained by and encapsulate and surrounded by, unless it starts to bring the fight to them, unless it starts to point a finger at the people who are perpetrating this dishonest recapitulation of politics into a kind of democratic illiteracy. Okay, so I mean, there are lots of ways of going about this, but essentially, the important thing is that whatever is chosen needs to be a kind of thematic motif that can be repeated ad nauseum, so that it can start to drill into people, and people can start to use it as a reference to see that the DA's ideological position is the only honest one, as it were, or at least that the people who accuse the DA of things are fundamentally dishonest. And so it's not enough merely to say, we think that you are wrong. We need to say why you are wrong when you accuse the DA of being racist. We need to have that as a kind of, as an ideological case, or as a claim that the DA is making, and a claim that the DA is consistently making again and again and again, so that the electorate can start to actually be on our side, rather than have sympathy when we defend ourselves from the next wave of accusations and specious contentiousness. And, you know, because if we don't assail their claim to hold the moral high ground, and also the kind of the orthodoxy of how reality gets interpreted, if we just let that sail by, is just a kind of ideological bucket fishing that we will eventually, the kind of attrition that they get to play, because we essentially, we don't fight back ideologically. Now, I understand why there would be an impetus not to fight back ideologically, because then you think, well, a lot of people maybe aren't very politically attuned, and they only vote for the DA out of pragmatic, sort of utilitarian reasons, that the DA is like a cleaner party on some level, but they don't know what to think about identity politics, and they don't know what to think about all the racial consciousness and all the racial politics in this country, and they actually vote for the DA, but they're slightly on the fence because they don't know if they're on the wrong side of history, or something like that. And if we start to make a stink about all this stuff a bit too much by actually accusing people who in our view are on the wrong side of this debate, and who are being dishonest, then maybe, sort of we'll add to the ideological furnace that we're being slowly baked in. We will exacerbate our now, I think that's a losing game, because if we don't deal with this ideological opposition, there is no perspective for growth, or for actually, because really what the DA needs to do is it needs to capture people that used to vote for the ANC. That's really what it needs to target. We need to, people who can't even bring themselves to vote for another political party, and instead just choose not to vote for the ANC, and they're sitting out elections. We need to get those people voting for the DA. We need to flip voters, essentially, that used to vote for the ANC, and they already used to vote for the ANC because they don't vote for them anymore, and they don't vote for anyone now. And they are going through the period of time in which they are so shocked and they're so fed up that finally they stop voting. Now, in their mind, they need to get their bearings. They need to get a waypoint, and they need to get some understanding about what's going on in politics. Now, if the DA is only defending itself from accusations and trying to constantly prove that it's not a racist by playing ball with not agitating or poking the bear, or sort of indicting the elephant in the room that keeps on being part of this sort of corrupt media consensus that keeps on creating waves of ideological sort of race baiting, we're never going to convert any of these people on the fence. We really do have to try to educate the electorate on this point, and be a leader in on this point. It's a winning condition to eventually, and the DA also, as the anchor of a coalition, needs to have a sophisticated, or a properly principled set of politics that can anchor the coalition from compromising. And I'm going to talk about the problem of compromising with identity politics, because essentially you will just create the same kind of corruption, essentially, and you'll create the same kind of disempowerment. I mean, this is what I can't remember his surname, but I was watching a political commentator, Solly, and he was making such a stupid argument that the DA essentially under Musi Maimane was going through a necessary sort of transitionary process in the electorate while they were essentially becoming the ANC light, and that essentially that you can't educate voters essentially to vote against black economic empowerment. Um, you, Even though he doesn't like racial policy, it's a necessary thing because you can't educate the electorate um, that this stuff is bad. So instead, you must just kind of concede uh, to playing the game the way that the ANC plays the game. You have to mimic and imitate their politics entirely, essentially. You have to be condescending to voters, essentially. Um, it's the worst kind of sort of soft racism um, that essentially, and then you can kind of give yourself this huge scope that, oh well, you're going to be a proper custodian of generating double standards. You're going to be anyway. I mean, this is a losing proposition essentially, and let me just get into the kind of the ideological matrix of this. Now, let me put it quite simply. Um, if you proceed from the assumption or from the moral so-called principle that the project of symbolic empowerment of the identity is a valid moral proposition, if you want to create a political uh, um, uh, um, if you want to feed a political sensibility or feed a political sentiment that how politics should be conducted and how empowerment or development should be conducted is essentially through the vehicle or through the project of the symbolic empowerment of the identity. What that means is that you allow yourself to devise double standards. You allow yourself to inject double standards into institutions. Um, Now, as soon as you do that, you've essentially lost the plot completely, because now you've created a perverse incentive to rationalize those double standards and to find a way to justify them. And the only way that you can do that is by essentially identifying divisive realizations, essentially creating a toxic form of racial consciousness, looking for what divides people, not for what unites them, because they don't have common standards. They don't have, instead, they have double standards now that you've enforced on them. And so you have to find a way to rationalize the entire world according to those double standards, which means that you end up having to create essentially some form of separate but equal development. It's unavoidable. It's indispensable when you have proceeded from that moral supposition of the project of the symbolic empowerment of the identity, or the representative empowerment of identitarian tokens. So if you have any kind of policy or program that treats people like representatives of a faction that is defined in some way, then you're going to essentially correlate moral consideration with whatever category system that you used in order to identify belonging to, which is why essentially you should only ever use criteria that is non-racial, which is also what the Constitution demands and requires. Obviously not in terms of how the Constitutional Court has messed these things up, which is another leg of an argument that we should actually bring up in politics. How the Constitutional Court has failed to defend the Constitution on this point, and they have essentially said that it's going to be a democratic issue, that the democracy gets to define how the value of non-racialism is going to be pursued, at least in the subject of affirmative action, and transformative policy, essentially, which essentially means that they have failed to use the criteria laid down in the limitations clause. They don't get past the opening paragraph because they just say, no, it is fundamentally justified in a democratic society because there's a kind of um, democratic mandate that the government holds, therefore it can make whatever policy it wants to on this matter, which is an utterly disgusting and reprehensible position because we have a supreme constitution and it should not be up to a citizenry to vote against what is unconstitutional if they want to have their constitutional protections entrenched, especially when we are in such a situation when the government is not, I would argue, democratically legitimate on the level of being able to contend against constitutional guarantees and protections, when essentially a minority of uh, um, you, if a government does not command a majority of the eligible voting electorate, at least up to the level of 66%, how does it have the legitimacy essentially to override a constitutional protection? The idea that the democracy should get to reinterpret the fundamental values in the Constitution is it's a I mean, this is an argument of an ideologically appointed reprobate that essentially should be indicted for crimes against humanity or at the very least impeached as a judge because they obviously do not deserve to be a constitutional judge. But I mean, these are the kinds of judges who have also said that, you shouldn't pick a judge based on merit and excellence in the field of being able to administer justice, essentially their credentials that would help them promote transformation, being black, having superficial characteristics, is more important than their actual merits. And so, I guess that's why we have an institutionalized corruption of a constitutional order, is because we've already essentially given into the idolatry of black pride and the black identity, and where we vest the height of moral consideration, and everything else just sort of falls in line under that. So, okay, let me not get too esoteric, but you can already see how the kind of the fascistic project, how it kind of morally corrupts institutions, and how it creates this kind of perverse incentive towards rationalizing and creating a worldview that is consistent with double standards, which is essentially makes it inconsistent with the rule of law and kind of creates these ad hoc or capricious or kind of specious ways of reinterpreting and semantically gerrymandering things to make it look cohesive or cogent when it's just more corruption essentially. And we've let all of that in essentially because we proceeded from immoral premises that the symbolic empowerment of the identity can actually be useful when it's really just an engine of moral corruption which has a kind of necessary which has a kind of uh, I mean, because it's fundamentally also a kind of metaphor of itself. It's a paradox waiting to happen because the identity itself is a kind of abstraction, and symbolic empowerment of something that is already abstract means that you can just kind of metaphorically create a disgusting racial consciousness. You can grow racial consciousness in this country and nothing else grows. You can empower the identity and disempower real people who are poor. You can do all of those things simultaneously, but then they can just keep on doubling down on the same ideological project and we all get nowhere. We just get devastation. So it's the same moral corruption as apartheid. It's the same moral degeneration and denigration and dehumanization as apartheid. And it causes the same devastation. But the problem is that they actually get to use their own ideological failures as fuel for doubling down and demanding even more radical of the same solution that is destroying us in the first place. And essentially, it's the moral corruption that is a complete parallel to the state corruption, essentially. Um, and someone has to sort of draw that parallel and make that sort of argument. But essentially, how I would argue that it should be done in the South African context is that you can use ESCOM as a perfect contemporary example, sort of. I mean, it's funny because they preemptively know their own sore spots, and they try to create sophisticated rhetoric to kind of cover up their own weaknesses in their own ideology, which requires an indictment. They'll say, don't say that we're fiddling while Rome burns. We're not fiddling while Rome burns. Transformation and black economic empowerment and sort of the symbolic empowerment of the black identity, essentially, is what they're saying, is still a very important, high contending issue on the agenda, because without that, we don't have the moral argument to beat off our ideological scapegoats with. And especially when the ideological scapegoat is just defending against this constantly and not actually indicting them of essentially creating a diversion from their own misdeeds and their own lack of accountability and responsibility, because essentially they have a higher moral argument to rely on to kind of tide them over, and then to sort of whip up an ideological frenzy in the media all the time. Which is very psychologically alluring to people, because they don't have to do very much thinking to get on board with the kind of the oversimplified reduction of what's going on, because the symbolic empowerment of the identity is something that anyone can create a rationalization, a toxic racial consciousness rationalization around, and you can just gerrymander the facts to kind of fit that kind of polemic, where they are constantly dishonestly accusing the DA of what it is that they are doing, which is essentially promoting a disgusting form of racial consciousness and racist politics. We need to call out these racist journalists. We need to start calling them racists, essentially. But we have to do it with the right kind of argument attached to it that is repetitive enough that we can start to drill home that counter accusation and that indictment. In fact, so that it becomes the prime lever of change so that they actually think twice about throwing accusations around, because those accusations come with the implicit confirmation of the prosecution or the prosecution of the DA's principles and beliefs. Because it's not enough to defend your principles and beliefs, but we must prosecute and morally indict those who are adversarial to those beliefs. Otherwise, it's just ideological bucket fishing. And so, again, I think the best metaphor of the time is essentially ESCOM. You can use ESCOM as a general broad case as to how they have destroyed and devastated through their kind of the ideological disguise of the symbolic empowerment of the black identity. What passes as transformation is a kind of devastation that leaves us all disempowered, and that it doesn't actually help people, doesn't uplift them. It creates artificial, unsustainable, inverted commas, empowerment, which it leaves us with artificial and unsustainable disempowerment is what it actually creates. Okay, now I haven't actually made the kind of metaphor around ESCOM properly myself now, so because I'm trying to explain it, so I'm not. But yeah, so essentially, I think the starting claim really is to make a moral equivalency between apartheid and this kind of politics, the politics of the ANC and the EFF, and also how they run things. We need to make a moral indictment We need to say that, we are suffering from racism in this country, but it's not the so-called systemic racism that they are talking about. It's the actual social injustice that they are perpetrating, ironically, in the name of social justice, because they have destroyed the meaning of the phrase social justice. Because they want to scapegoat and use as a sacrificial lamb a section of the society for the greater good of everyone else. They want to use a disgusting moral project of the symbolic empowerment of the identity, and they want to sacrifice things to the symbolic empowerment of the identity. And that is what they call social justice, but that is actually the definition of social injustice. If you are in a lawless situation that is out of the ordinary, out of necessity, you can do things to stay alive for your own survival. But the state does not get to administer a radical program of ironically inverse social justice and call it social justice out of its own deepening necessity because of its own incompetence, which then it instead of being held accountable to the Constitution, it gets to rewrite all the rules because of the emergency that it created. And so, it's fundamentally dependent on a kind of democratic illiteracy, but also a disintegration of the standing of the rule of law and the standing of the Constitution, which, is part of their project of destroying. So, yeah, at some point, the Constitution has to be pointed at, and we have to talk about the betrayal of it, and we have to talk about the undermining of it and the subversion of it by these politicians, and we have to basically say, well, our prophet that we follow is actually Mandela, and your prophet that you are following is Charles Manson. You wanted to bring and you're driving us into, the kind of the world that Charles Manson prophesized about. Where you've destroyed common standards. Okay, sorry, I'm getting all over the place, and I'm sort of getting into the weeds here. So look, to craft a message, you have to work out concise, pithy, things that can fit on an election poster. And then you have to see how there are multiple arguments, because, there are lots of ways that they will try to discombobulate and disentangle an ideological position. But we have to start surmounting an ideological position that actually confronts. We have to start making moral comparisons, and we have to start indicting people on the basis of our principles and values, not just defending against what we disagree with. Because if we don't wield the sword, as it were, if we only wield a shield, people will naturally think that we don't have conviction about our principles, or that we don't think that they fare well against the ideological opposition. They will think that, oh, well, we know that we're ideologically inferior, or something like that. And yes, it is, you could say, it's going to look ugly, it's going to look a bit scruffy or something like that. Well, it only looks a bit scruffy if you can't kind of get a kind of ideological cohesion around it within the DA, which is this is what I think is the biggest is the sorest point of the DA, is that the DA needs to be agile about its ideological opposition, and it's maybe limited because it doesn't know how many people inside the DA are on board, because how many people themselves are kind of like in the vein of Van Damme, and Musi Mayamane, have that kind of toxic racial politics which they think is essentially part of the key of success, which is because in some sense, if you are accused of being racist, there are two ways of going about it, or of seeking to disprove them. You can either make an indictment against them and try to prove your case and try to educate people and try to get people on your side, or you can essentially sort of agree with the people who are accusing the DA of being racist and employ your own double standards and employ your own symbolic empowerment of the identity, which is essentially a poison pill proposition that leads you with no principles, leads you with racial consciousness and a kind of internal self-inconsistency that in some sense means that only a fascist, only a full-blown racial consciousness person can properly ever fit that bill, can properly ever sort of fit those boots. And you are then part of also the moral degeneration and and a kind of constitutional subversion and undermining, because you proceeded from the premise of the symbolic empowerment of the identity, which will always create some kind of moral cost within the double standards that it perpetuates, which will always have to be rationalized, and then you kind of have this natural propensity, this natural perverse incentive towards a kind of fractious, disgusting form of racial consciousness, which is like people like Van Damme, are perfect examples of. These are people who are incredibly morally corrupt people. These are people that, in an ideal sense, would have had to kind of make an ideological debate about their views, but they are so dishonest fundamentally because they only care about their moral consideration is vested in an abstraction, and the means can always be justified by the ends, and they love just kind of devising this, because when you are creating double standards, you can really treat people, it's like the inverse of the categorical imperative in terms of the Kantian deontology. You get to treat people as a means to an ends and not as an ends in themselves. So it's a fundamentally dehumanizing mindset. These are people that are patently wicked. They're patently psychologically, how they treat people. They treat people as tokens of an identity group. They can't escape their own racial essentialism, essentially, because even if they're not philosophically committed to racial essentialism, they believe that morality is confined within a racial matrix. So what is the difference if you say that you're not a racial essentialist, but essentially you believe that morality should be mediated and dictated, and you sort of that intervention should happen on the basis of a kind of token representation? Obviously, you're going to be incentivized to creating disgusting racial generalizations about people, and then you can't see what brings people together in a kind of, the only commitment and the only sort of is because the only form of banding together that they believe in is that, oh well, we need to band together to exalt the idolatry of the symbolic empowerment of the identity. We all need to pray and bolster and exalt the black identity and restore the pride of the black identity. And sort of when that is your moral priority, or a kind of you've got some kind of sociological bunk idea about how that is the psychological gate to actually unlocking the potential of people, you've created a metaphor of empowerment which is so psychological and so pragmatically useless and also poisonous that you've got a kind of it's such an engine of bad faith. It's such an engine of dishonesty about, you create such a tunnel vision in terms of reality. You create a tunnel reality, in fact, and you have to get on top of the bandwagon. You have to sort of join that worm to eat its own tail, because that's the only thing that it's capable of connecting up with is itself. It's fundamentally solipsistic in its view. It can't contend with anything outside of its bubble reality. It is really a worm. or a snake eating its own tail. Um, and that's all it does, is that it consumes for itself, and I guess it sets things on fire that doesn't already agree with it, So it's sort of, that's how it, and if we don't, the only way to beat that kind of fire is a kind of consistency, a repetitive and a cohesion, that we have to be ideologically agile enough to fight this thing. And trying to placate it is going to be a lose condition. So there isn't actually two choices. There's only one choice: to disproving its accusation. The only way to disprove its accusation is to prove that it is racist. That is the only way to do it. And it's not an easy, I mean, I've just done it through metaphor, and I've done it through talking about some esoteric things and mentioning things. And obviously, this has to be done uh, on a scale that is palatable, and that is capable of breaking through the electorate. But there are ways of doing that, is that you conduct skirmishes, essentially. You make an indictment, and then you continually make the same indictment, and until someone takes you up on the charge, and then you defend the claim. But essentially, then you can start to dismiss people who start coming up with you, essentially trying to get you to dignify their specious interpretation of reality that comes from their disgusting racial consciousness, where you say, look, I've answered that question, and you're just asking me the same question again, and you're essentially and you're trying to make it look like that I don't have an answer to your question, when I've answered each iteration of this question, that you're just trying to make it look like that I don't have an answer to this question. But actually, I've already answered this question. I'm not answering it again. You're just asking me the same question in a different way. And the reason why you're doing so is because you have a moral principle that I don't agree with. I don't agree with you. We don't have the same worldview. And I've already essentially made that clear in the answers that I've already given you. So instead of trying to beat me over the head with your worldview, which I obviously disagree with, and that you aren't making vulnerable to any kind of contention, because you're saying I'm the journalist, I get to ask the questions, and I don't get to ask the questioner questions because I'm just the politician or something like that. You have to turn it around on these people at some point, and you have to actually make the moral indictment against them, because this is how the false narrative is being construed. This is how the false narrative is being contrived, and how we are only defending against it, and how we're not essentially, it's not enough to defend against it. We have to actually point it out to the electorate, and point it out to people in general, as to how this thing is dishonestly taking up too much space, because it is essentially, it is the arm of corruption within our society. It is the cultural arm of the state corruption in our society. It is the moral corruption, which is the parallel of the devastation that we suffer from in South African society. And until we develop some kind of moral argument to contend in this kind of toxic ideological arena, I don't think it's possible that we're going to actually break through and make new ground, essentially. And so perhaps we need to create workshops within the DA to get people to understand these points more broadly, so that we can know that people understand the stuff inside out, so that they don't, so that when someone makes a stand within the DA, that we don't break the line, as it were, for some kind of utilitarian reason. Like, for example, I mean, I know ostensibly, for example, why the posters were retracted. Ostensibly, why the posters were retracted was because some campaigners in some rural areas did not feel safe, because they were threatened for belonging to the DA, essentially, on the basis of the DA is racist because of these posters. Now, that doesn't make sense for a lot of reasons, but in as much as that the threats are credible, what are we actually dealing with here? We're dealing with henchmen and thugs of political ideology saying you're not allowed to challenge our ideological framing of the narrative. If you challenge our ideological framing of the narrative and you don't allow us to hold the moral high ground and you don't allow us to hold the orthodoxy and we get to interpret reality based on our racial consciousness, if you don't allow us to do that, we won't let you campaign on the streets. We won't let you campaign for your political party unless your political party already concedes the moral high ground and already concedes the orthodoxy to us, and we get to interpret through our racial consciousness what things mean, how to read posters. That is the nexus of the fight that we confront in a nutshell. And it would have been better, on some level, to then magnify that issue and say, we're not going to retract, or I mean, let's just say if we had more, this is a thought experiment. I'm not trying to relitigate history. This is just, so imagine, I think it was a perfect example. In fact, we can still use this as an example. So we can say, perhaps it's slightly too confusing to say, oh, well, we shouldn't have retracted the posters, but we did so out of necessity because we wanted to campaign. But imagine if we said, okay, well, let's not retract the posters, and let's actually say, yes, these people, they can't campaign because they do feel threatened. So let's just say we weren't able to campaign because people threatened us with violence. That's how much democracy has been destroyed in this country. That's how much racial politics has corrupted things. To magnify that issue and to frame that issue is that this is how much the corruption of democratic illiteracy, because of the obsession with racial politics, has gotten on the ANC EFF side of the political divide. This is the only way that they can actually operate, in politics now, and because they have to control the narrative, and they will do so through any dirty trick and through any amount of henchmen and thugs, fascistic thugs in the street, protecting their brittle ideological line, and essentially calling them on their honesty in essentially, oh, well, the reason why we're going to threaten you with violence is because we actually believe that you're racist. That's why we can't let you campaign, because you're too racist that we can't let you campaign. I mean, really, like, we're going to dignify that line, that dishonest line in the sand. See, this is what I'm saying is why we need we need to prosecute our principles and morally indict our opponents. That's a huge opportunity to morally indict our opponent and to show, you see, I guess it gets slightly lost in the weeds if you try to explain it. You just you have to state it and kind of not explain it, and only kind of explain it once a kind of disgusting rationalization has, once they've developed their counter narrative, and then you just kind of dismiss the counter narrative as being, ludicrous or something like that. You do have to kind of avoid explaining as much as possible, but you do have to create a repetitive line in the sand that people can start to actually see that it's all just illusion and propaganda on the other side. And how you really have to shock people to such an extent that it's so shocking how contrived and confabulated sort of the alternative reality is to the DA reality. And we need to stop dignifying them, and we need to start indicting them instead of essentially entertaining and dignifying their specious interpretation, which is premised in their disgusting worldview. So we just need to say, look, obviously we don't believe in the racial worldview, and so when journalists create this narrative, and when people have their something that Van Damme would say, or something that Patricia DeLille would say, that this is, people find this offensive. Well, the people who find this offensive are racialists. They are racists, and we don't agree with them, and we think that they are part of the problem, and they're part of the devastation of this country. They're part of why ESCOM doesn't work, essentially. They're disempowering us all with their disgusting morality. Now, okay, I've said that in quite a blunt way. There's probably a different kind of curt way to say that. But that is what we need to start developing. And if we don't start to do this, we're not going to win the people on the fence, because the people on the fence right now are saying the DA only defends against this stuff, and the other side actually indicts people who don't go along with them. So if I go with the DA, I'm going to be atomized, and I'm going to be ideologically bucket fished until I kind of, I'm going to have to independently defend myself, because the DA does not essentially go after these cry bullies, or and these racial scapegoat artists. They defend against them, but they don't sort of go after them. And I mean, it is slightly problematic, because all the institutions are set up in such an institutionally corrupt way that it flows from essentially the moral corruption that has already been embedded into the constitutional law now. And so we kind of have to say that sort of that we're not running on the proper principle of non-racialism in the country anymore. Our institutions have given up on non-racialism, and they've kind of created an alternative to it. And this reinterpretation has created a noxious moral political arena of a corrupt nature that is fundamentally morally corrupt, but that we also suffer from the practical effects of this, which is a kind of state corruption. But that is a symptom of the moral corruption. And if we don't properly identify the moral corruption, there is no solution to be had. Now, okay, I understand that that's very verbose, so you can't fit that on an election poster. But you can exemplify it, and you can exemplify it in such a way that you have a kind of the moral lesson built into that, which is that when you put racism into institutions, in order to try to fix history or something like that, or that the means will be justified by the ends. You can't use racism and say that the means will be justified by the ends, because you destroy social justice, and at the same time you destroy the criteria by which you would even know if real authentic development could even have taken place or not, because you've just created an artificial, gerrymandered, kind of outcome, and then you have to rationalize that outcome by creating a kind of collective group guilt, and also, anyway, I mean, but you can just look at all the examples of this. You can look at ESCOM. It's a perfect generalizable example of this. When we destroy meritocracy and we destroy accountability because the highest priority is the symbolic empowerment of the black identity, and then we don't meet targets, and we don't meet we don't do planning, because all our planning is geared towards the symbolic empowerment of the black identity, or just symbolic empowerment of identity. The destruction of meritocracy means that we don't even have a clear lens to view development and transformation. We can't even see if development and transformation has even happened. And most people who are worth, okay, well, that's a bit inflammatory to phrase it like that, but most people understand this psychologically, and most people have left the country. Many black professionals will not put up with this kind of toxic culture, and they will go be a finance person in London. They will just go overseas, because why would they put up with the legitimate concern or the legitimate idea that they didn't earn their position and that they don't know what they're doing? Because the credentials in South Africa are all tainted. because we've destroyed meritocracy. We've destroyed standards. We don't have common standards. And if we don't have common standards, in the same way that we also have destroyed justice, in some sense, South Africa has a very traumatic history with a lot of moral poison and moral injustice in it. The only thing holding the new South Africa together is a common sense of justice that we could all agree on, and that was actually a correct form of justice. But now that that's been institutionally corrupted, we're in a very bad state. And if we don't sort of talk about reclaiming institutions, talk about, people are talking about, trying to provincialize electricity and provincialize policing, but we should probably talk about provincializing the universities and education more so, because if we don't get a hold of the syllabus and we don't get a hold of how these things are run, we are really setting ourselves up for a toxic, never-ending, kind of spiral into democratic illiteracy, and essentially a complete destabilization of the constitutional order, which is essentially already in full swing. But how to recover the constitution and how to reverse these trends does require more of a partisanship, an ideological partisanship that is actually capable of wielding a sword and not just a shield, as it were. It's a necessity, and I think that it's also a necessity to get people on the fence eventually to come our way. It's a necessary win. It's a necessary condition for winning in some kind of coalition, is that someone has to be the sword, as it were. I mean, perhaps we have people in the coalition that would be in the coalition that are already trying to sort of appeal to people who have been bitten by the identitarian bug, and maybe they're kind of palatable enough that the DA could get in bed with them. But if the DA does not create a strong enough structure that other people can conform with, as it were, then when it comes to make a broad coalition, it's going to end up compromising too much, because in some sense there are certain red lines that can't be crossed, and because otherwise you just get more of the same, and you just get, essentially, you're going to get a redevelopment of the same kind of corruption, because this kind of moral poison, what has happened to the DA, what has happened to the ANC, and what also happened to the DA under Masi, in some sense, it was a miracle that that the DA was able to pull itself back from the moral corruption that Mmusi Maimane represents. That's no small feat, and obviously, turnaround time, but we need to shore up cohesion around this ideological point so that we can start being more agile about it and being more have the acuity and to and look, I can understand the reticence around this, because you don't want to rock the boat where progress is being made. Because, a lot of people are doing a lot of work in the organization, and you perhaps also don't know exactly what their views are on all of these things, or if how much they understand the ideological imperative to contest against our ideological adversaries. But essentially, just playing defense is, it might help you hold on to some degree, but I think that and obviously, the strategy that I am proselytizing now certainly has some risk, but I think that it's a necessary winning condition for the DA, or for a broad coalition even, is that the DA has to, in some sense, it has to restore the trust in non-racialism, which is also what has caused the kind of attrition that the DA has suffered in the Western Cape to these parties like the Patriotic Alliance and, all these kind of identitarian type parties, the Cape Coloured Congress, and the kind of and I guess Good is probably counts as one of these identitarian identity politics type political parties. that, you know, when under Musi Maimane, when non-racialism was essentially uh, was hollowed out in terms of the DA, that really, I think, shook people's trust in the at least a significant minority within the Western Cape said, well, then we have to get an identitarian representation, because otherwise we'll have no seat at the table to get anything. Because this is how it's going to be played now, is that, well, if you are going to get into the contest of the symbolic empowerment of the identity, we need a kind of an identitarian political vehicle in order to get a piece of the pie for our community, and to get into the kind of, because essentially we all have to make our own sympathy grab and demand over the systemic culpability that some kind of leadership then has to kind of placate all the sympathy demands in order, and there's no longer a common vision, and there's no longer the rule of law in terms of administering a just form of development and transformation. Transformation development no longer becomes an issue about that is done according to proper social justice. It's done according to, well, some people lose while other people get exalted. And when you have that kind of sort of sorry, I'm going to say something that's actually a bit of sort of a sword of Damocles kind of Russian roulette, kind of form of some form of developmental model. I mean, you've literally created the most toxic kind of, I would even call it proto-fascistic engine of politics and racial consciousness. I mean, this is what has destroyed democratic literacy in this country, is that essentially the courts and the justice system has allowed the government to get away with policy that essentially turns the concept of transformation into a kind of sword of Damocles Russian roulette. And because we've normalized that, because we essentially have not confronted that directly ideologically and called that out ideologically and talked about how fundamentally insidious this sort of whole thing is and how it radically reframes. I mean, it all, the problem that we face is really to do with the state of betrayal in the constitutional law, which is quite frankly a crime against humanity. I mean, these judges, we need a Truth and Reconciliation Commission around this, or we need a Nuremberg trials, or we need to impeach these judges at the very least if they can't essentially radically change the law on this issue that they have corrupted and institutionally corrupted. But or we need a quorum of judges to rise up and say, we're not going to accept this constitutional court, we're going to convene our own constitutional court, and we're going to reestablish the constitutional order, we're going to recover the supremacy of the Constitution, and we're not going to let the government, essentially, with their politically appointed judges and their ideological plants, subvert the constitutional order so that they can continue with their corruption, essentially, disguising it with this convoluted moral poison. And we cannot say that the Constitution has failed us. We can say that the constitutional order has been betrayed. And there are very many people who don't understand what's actually in the Constitution. And yes, it is quite complicated because justice, by its nature, in some sense, needs a lot of principles and values, and it needs a lot of checks and things like that. It needs a lot of legal tests, of which the limitations clause is a necessary leg of all these things. And when the Constitutional Court failed to use all the criteria in the limitations clause, because they just said, no, there's a governmental prerogative that they can choose to do this. Therefore, we can't apply the criteria in the limitations clause because there's a governmental prerogative which is justified within a democracy. So therefore, we won't have to understand the value of non-racialism. The government can reinterpret and redefine what non-racialism means. That's effectively what the Constitutional Court did, is it allowed the government to redefine what non-racialism means. And no one batted an eye. No one even said anything about this. We just proceed like, oh, well, that's what happens in America, so it can happen here because, our Constitution is no different than the American Constitution. Never mind that, it has to be justified not in a democracy, it has to be justified in a liberal democracy, and a liberal democracy cannot tolerate the intolerance paradox, which is what has been constructed here out of this ideological poison of this racialism, which is why we are fundamentally a non-racialist country, which they have given to the government to unilaterally redefine and to essentially gaslight a whole population, which now has to cobble together some kind of political solution to this poison, to this fascistic poison, which we should have been protected against by our Constitution and by the guardians of our Constitution who have failed in their duty and should at the very least be impeached and perhaps at the most be imprisoned for their constitutional damages, of which there is very little excuse. One can only hope that there is a special space in a circle of hell waiting to receive the souls of those, to join those of the Nazis and the other people who have promoted this poison that we are still sitting with even after it was solved. It was solved in theory, it was solved on paper, it was solved in morality, it was solved by Mandela, to then be overturned by these miscreants and these wicked people who go morally unindicted. But I believe that this must change. It is a necessary condition for winning and recovering the soul of South Africa, and to restore the new South Africa and the vision of the new South Africa, which has been stabbed in the back, it has been betrayed. And the question is, can it be resurrected? And I don't think it's wrong to put that proposition to the electorate, and in some sense to make the electorate worthy of the restoration of our Constitution, which deserves to be restored. But perhaps not everyone ever perhaps believed in the Constitution. But that is a moral argument that is worth being made, and it's worth being had. It's worth being fought over. That is worth beseeching your neighbors on. And I think the DA needs to develop the acuity to include this within its partisan position,